I always thought isolation was a luxury, a privilege you pay for when the noise of the city becomes too much to bear. I was working 80-hour weeks at a corporate job that was slowly draining the life out of me. I needed a break. I needed absolute silence. So I went online and found what looked like the perfect escape. It was a beautiful A-frame cabin nestled deep in the dense pine forests of Oregon. The pictures showed massive floor-to-ceiling windows, a cozy wood-burning stove, and absolutely no neighbors for miles. The listing proudly stated that cell service was spotty at best, and there was no television. To me, that did not sound like a warning. It sounded like paradise. I booked a 4-day stay immediately, packed a single duffel bag, and drove 6 hours out of the city. The last hour of the drive was entirely on an unpaved logging road. The towering evergreen trees created a thick canopy overhead, blocking out the afternoon sun and casting deep, long shadows across the dirt path. By the time I arrived at the cabin, twilight was already setting in. The air was biting cold, carrying the sharp, clean scent of pine needles and damp earth. The cabin was exactly as pictured. It was stunning. I unlocked the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The interior was warm and inviting, with exposed wooden beams and a plush rug in the center of the living room. The main wall was almost entirely glass, offering a breathtaking view of the dark forest outside. There was a small kitchen, a bathroom on the ground floor, and a wooden ladder leading up to an open loft where the bed was located. I spent the first evening unpacking, lighting a fire, and reading a book on the couch. For the first time in months, my mind felt quiet. The silence of the woods was absolute. It was so quiet that I could hear my own heartbeat, the crackle of the burning wood, and the occasional creak of the cabin settling in the cold. I slept incredibly well that first night. I felt safe. I felt hidden from the world. But that false sense of security was exactly what made the next few days so terrifying. I woke up late the next morning, feeling completely refreshed. The sun was streaming through the massive windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I climbed down the ladder, made a cup of coffee, and headed into the bathroom to wash my face. I turned on the faucet and splashed cold water on my skin. As I reached for a towel, my eyes landed on the small porcelain cup resting on the edge of the sink. Inside the cup was a blue toothbrush. I stared at it for a moment, my sleep-addled brain trying to process what I was seeing. I had brought a red toothbrush, and mine was currently sitting inside my waterproof toiletry bag, zipped up in my duffel. I picked up the blue toothbrush by the plastic handle. The bristles were damp, not just slightly humid from the room, but visibly wet, as if someone had run it under the water and used it just a few minutes ago. A sudden, cold prickle of unease washed over my arms. I stood frozen in the bathroom, listening intently. There was no sound other than the dripping of the faucet. I tried to apply logic to the situation. Rationalization is a powerful coping mechanism. I told myself that the cleaning crew must have been rushing to get the cabin ready before I arrived. One of them probably brushed their teeth, left it behind by mistake, and the moisture was just trapped in the cold bathroom air. It was a gross oversight, but it was harmless. I threw the blue toothbrush directly into the trash can, washed my hands twice, and walked back out to the living room. I decided not to let a careless mistake ruin my peaceful retreat. I spent the afternoon hiking a short trail near the cabin, breathing in the crisp air and taking photos of the landscape. When I returned, the sun was beginning to dip below the tree line, painting the sky in deep shades of purple and bruising gray. The temperature dropped rapidly, so I decided to change into warmer clothes. I opened my duffel bag to grab my favorite heavy gray hoodie. I dug through my neatly folded shirts, my jeans, my socks. I emptied the entire contents of the bag onto the floor. The hoodie was gone. I sat on the wooden floor, staring at the pile of clothes. I distinctly remembered packing it. I remembered holding it in my hands, debating whether to wear it for the drive or pack it, and ultimately stuffing it into the side pocket of the bag. But it was not there. I searched the entire cabin. I checked the bathroom, the kitchen counters, the space behind the couch, and the loft upstairs. Nothing. The unease that had settled in my stomach earlier that morning returned, much heavier this time. I grabbed my phone. The signal bar showed one weak dot of connection. It took 3 tries, but I finally managed to send a text message to the Airbnb host. I explained that I had found a used wet toothbrush in the bathroom and that an item of my clothing seemed to be missing. I asked if anyone else had access to the cabin. The reply took 20 agonizing minutes to come through. When it did, it was dismissive and brief. The host wrote, "Hi there. So sorry about the toothbrush. The cleaning lady must have forgotten it. As for your sweater, you probably misplaced it while unpacking or left it at home. You are the only one with the door code. Enjoy your stay." I stared at the bright screen of my phone. The message offered a perfectly logical explanation, but human instinct is rarely logical, and my instinct was screaming at me that something was terribly wrong. As night fell, the massive glass windows transformed from beautiful viewing portals into terrifying black mirrors. With the lights on inside, I could not see anything out in the darkness, but anyone standing in the woods could see every single thing I was doing. I walked over to the windows and pulled the heavy curtains shut, making sure there were no gaps. I double-checked the deadbolt on the front door. I checked the lock on the back door. I even grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet from the kitchen and placed it on the floor next to the ladder leading up to the loft. I was being paranoid, I told myself. I was letting the isolation play tricks on my tired mind. I climbed up to the loft, got into bed, and turned off the small reading lamp. The darkness in the cabin was suffocating. The silence was no longer peaceful. It felt heavy, expectant, like a held breath. I lay there for hours, staring up at the slanted wooden ceiling, straining my ears for any sound out of the ordinary. Eventually, exhaustion overtook my fear, and I drifted into a restless, uneasy sleep. I was violently jolted awake by a sound. It was not a loud, crashing noise. It was a tiny, sharp, mechanical click that happened right next to my left ear. My eyes snapped open in the pitch black. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird desperately trying to escape a cage. I held my breath, listening intensely into the suffocating darkness of the loft. Then I heard it again, a soft, whirring, mechanical sound followed by a quiet, sliding noise. It sounded exactly like an old Polaroid camera ejecting a fresh photograph. The rational part of my brain completely shut down, instantly replaced by pure, primal, animalistic terror. I slowly reached my trembling right hand out from under the heavy winter blankets. My fingers fumbled blindly in the cold, dark air until they finally brushed against the switch of the bedside lamp. I clicked it on. The sudden burst of yellow light blinded me for a terrible, agonizing second. When my vision finally cleared, I looked over at the small wooden nightstand next to the bed. My blood turned to absolute ice in my veins. There, sitting perfectly aligned next to my dead cell phone, were 3 square Polaroid photographs. The edges were still slightly white, still slowly developing the horrific images in the cold cabin air. I reached out with a violently shaking hand and picked up the first photograph. It was a picture of my face. My eyes were closed, my mouth slightly parted in a state of deep, vulnerable sleep. I picked up the second one. It was taken from a slightly different angle, much closer to my face, showing the texture of the pillow beneath my head. The third picture showed my entire upper body tightly wrapped in the thick blankets. The photos were taken from the very edge of the mattress, less than 2 feet away from where I was sleeping. The horrifying realization hit me with the physical force of a sledgehammer. Whoever took these photos did not just break into the cabin while I was asleep. They had been here the entire time. They had watched me unpack my duffel bag in the living room. They had watched me meticulously lock the doors and pull the heavy curtains shut. They had stood over me and watched me fall asleep in the dark. Suddenly, I heard a slow, deliberate, agonizing creak from the wooden ceiling directly above my head. I looked up slowly, the muscles in my freezing neck screaming in protest. Directly above the bed was a small square metal ventilation grate leading to a hidden attic crawl space. The grate had been unscrewed and pushed silently to the side. A pair of pale, wide, unblinking eyes was staring straight down at me from the pitch-black void. I did not scream. My vocal cords were completely paralyzed by absolute, suffocating fear. A massive surge of adrenaline flooded my nervous system, forcefully overriding my frozen muscles. I threw the heavy blankets off my body and scrambled frantically backward off the mattress. I did not bother looking for my thick winter boots. I did not grab my warm jacket. I snatched my car keys off the kitchen counter as I practically fell down the steep wooden ladder. My bare feet hit the freezing cold floorboards of the living room, and I sprinted blindly for the front door. My hands were shaking so violently that I struggled for 5 agonizing seconds to twist the metal deadbolt. Behind me, I heard the heavy, sickening, fleshy thud of someone dropping down from the high loft directly onto the living room floor. I ripped the heavy wooden door open and threw myself out into the freezing, unforgiving night air. The jagged dirt, sharp rocks, and frozen pine needles tore at the soft soles of my bare feet as I sprinted desperately toward my parked car. I hit the unlock button on the key fob, the electronic beep echoing loudly through the deadly silent woods. I yanked the driver's side door open, threw my trembling body inside, and slammed it shut, instantly smashing my fist onto the central locking button. I jammed the metal key into the ignition and twisted it with all my remaining strength. The car engine roared to life, breaking the heavy silence of the forest. I threw the gear shifter into reverse and slammed my bare foot hard onto the gas pedal. The heavy tires spun wildly in the loose dirt before finally catching traction, throwing the car backward in a wide, panicked arc. As the front of the vehicle swung around toward the unpaved dirt road, my bright headlights swept rapidly across the front of the dark cabin. The blinding white beams fully illuminated the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows. I instinctively slammed on the brakes, my heart stopping completely in my chest. Standing dead center in the living room, perfectly illuminated by my headlights, was a tall, incredibly thin figure. They were wearing my missing heavy gray hoodie. The hood was pulled up tight, casting a deep, sinister shadow over the top half of their face. But I could clearly see their mouth. They were smiling, a wide, unnatural, grotesque grin that stretched much too far across their pale face. Slowly, deliberately, the terrifying figure raised one long arm and gave me a slow, mocking wave goodbye. I shifted the car into drive and sped down that dark, treacherous logging road faster than I have ever driven in my entire life. I did not stop, did not even slow down, until I reached the brightly lit local police station in the nearest town, over 20 miles away. I burst through the double-glass doors, sobbing hysterically, covered in sweat and bleeding heavily from the soles of my feet. 2 armed police officers drove back up to the isolated cabin immediately while I waited trembling at the station, wrapped tightly in a silver foil shock blanket. They returned 3 grueling hours later with grim, pale faces. The cabin was completely empty. The heavy front door was wide open, violently swaying back and forth in the freezing wind. But when the officers investigated the hidden crawl space above the sleeping loft, they found an absolute nightmare. It was a filthy, claustrophobic makeshift nest lined with stolen old blankets, hundreds of empty food wrappers, and a small battery-operated power drill. The intruder had drilled a tiny, almost invisible peephole through the ceiling directly above the downstairs shower. They also found a thick stack of dozens of fresh Polaroid photos hidden carefully under the soiled blankets. Photos of previous guests sleeping peacefully. Photos of me hiking completely unaware earlier that afternoon. The police launched a massive manhunt, but they never caught the person who was living up there. There were no usable fingerprints, no identifying DNA left behind, and the furious host claimed to have absolutely no knowledge of the hidden space. I physically survived that trip to the woods, but my life has never been the same since that night. I live in a constant, exhausting state of extreme hypervigilance. I immediately moved out of my house and into a high-rise apartment with a strict 2-4-hour security guard, but it simply does not matter. Every single night, before I can even attempt to close my eyes, I have to obsessively check every single lock, look inside every empty closet, and shine a flashlight under the bed. But the absolute most crippling part of my ongoing trauma is the silence. I cannot sleep in the dark anymore, ever. And every single night, without fail, I have to set up a small digital recording camera on a tripod pointing directly at my bed. Because I know, deep down in my shattered bones, that the only way to be truly safe is to be the one watching.